Welcome back to the Saturday Scholars College Football Podcast. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. That is Xan. That is Gonzo. I am Shoob. And today we are here to do Big Ten West win totals. Let's go. Boys, we had a ton of fun last year doing this division, and I think we have another fun episode in store. Hope you guys are ready for it. Boys, you ready to get going here on the great Big Ten West?
Let's get into it, man. This one's exciting. When I looked at this being 8.5, I said to myself, no way, no how. That is an easy under. But then I opened my handy dandy notebook and I did a little bit of research. I did a little bit of digging.
The Texas Longhorns, a team that perennially underachieves. Are you telling me they are going to go 10-2 or are they going to go 8-4?
Get the dang police out there, because it's going to be animal cruelty what they're going to put this Buffalo through this season. Thank God that certain things are legal in Colorado, because you're going to need a lot of that to watch this team.
All right, starting at the top, I will lead us off with Wisconsin. The Badgers come in with a win total of 8.5 atop the Big Ten West Division to open up 2023. Well, there's a lot of news with Wisconsin this offseason, gentlemen. New head coach Luke Fickell. He comes in for his first season in Madison. This was an A-plus hire. I think both of us love this. Xan and I, we loved this from the jump when we were doing this podcast last year. Best hire of the offseason, in my opinion. And Wisconsin, future's looking pretty bright for the Badgers. But let's dive into this roster, this team going into 2023. Offense last year, 59th overall in offensive efficiency, pretty mediocre. They have a new offensive coordinator, Phil Longo from North Carolina. I thought that was another great hire by Luke Fickell. Brought in Phil Longo. He's going to be running the air raid. And we want to talk about complete contrast of offensive styles. Badger fans, for those of you who have been clamoring for a 2020s style offense for all those years, you have finally got it. Your wishes come true. Boy, it couldn't be any of different of a contrast for offensive scheme going into this year. The quarterback room, lots of turnover. Graham Mertz and Chase Wolf, they are both out. They have left for other destinations. In is Tanner Mordecai from SMU, Braden Locke from Mississippi State, and Nick Evers from Oklahoma. Tanner Mordecai is projected to be the starter. He, of course, had 2 full seasons as the starting guy at SMU, where he put up pretty respectable numbers against G5 competition. Running back room, Wisconsin got Braylon Allen to stay, which I thought was huge. Braylon Allen is going to be a huge returning piece to this offense. Ches Malucci as well. Both these guys are going to see a lot of pass catching, unlike they were seeing before. The wide receiver room and the tight end room, man, their top 3 pass catchers return. In addition to all these nice transfers that the Badgers brought in, they brought in CJ Williams from USC, Will Pauling from Cincinnati, and Bryson Green from Oklahoma State. Guys like Shamiri Dyke returning this year off of last year's team. You have won the lottery, because they are going to see a renaissance of production in this new scheme. I'm looking forward to it. The offensive line, it was actually pretty below average last year. They only have 49% line continuity, which is second to last in the Big Ten, which is a little bit of a red flag. However, there is one guy that I really like, left tackle, Jack Nelson. He's projected as a day 2 pick so far going into the season. But there's one thing about a lot of the guys that they have returning along the O-line. I've noticed that, of course, Phil Longo is going to be running the air raid scheme. Most of the offensive linemen they have returning, their pass grades were a lot better than their run blocking grades on PFF, which I think could be a good sign. It's a completely different scheme that these guys are going to have to learn, but we shall see. I think maybe it could be a good sign. Now moving over to the defense. Of course, the defense was a lot better last year, 21st in defensive efficiency. Mike Tressel is the new coordinator. He was brought over from Cincinnati by Fickell. Their defensive line, Badgers had one of the best in the country last year. They were 7th in the nation in line yards generated. They do lose Keanu Benton and Nick Herbig. This unit will be more thin going into this year because they're going to be running a 3-3-5 and a 2-4-5. So defensive line probably will take a step back. Linebacker room, pretty good with lots of depth. I like Miyama Njogmeta. Don't know if I said his name right, but he was great as the second best linebacker in the Big Ten. That's what matters. And I like this linebacker room a lot. And then the secondary, it was a weaker unit last year, and it does have a little bit of depth concerns. I'm interested to see the development in year one with this coaching staff, because this staff's rep, obviously, they were known for developing defensive backs. That's what they pumped into the NFL with 3-star recruits from Cincinnati at the G5 level. Not really inheriting a whole lot, in my opinion, with this Badgers secondary, but we shall see. On paper, however, might not necessarily be the strength of this defense. So when I look over at this team holistically, of course, we got to look at the schedule, guys. This is where the money is made. The all-important schedule, non-conference play, Buffalo at Washington State, Georgia Southern. I think there's a pretty good shot Wisconsin will be 3-0 after this non-conference slate, but I will say at Washington State in week 2, one thing I am a little bit concerned about is because this is a completely new offensive system that Wisconsin's going to be implementing. Didn't look a whole lot that great in the spring game. So I know Wazoo is losing a lot of players on defense, but Wazoo came into Camp Randall and beat y'all last year. I'm just saying, Cam Ward, I'd still be a little bit worried about that game. Then they start Big Ten play at Purdue, bye week before Rutgers, Iowa. I think all in all, this is a fairly light schedule to start the year. I think Wisconsin has the upside to go 5-0 to start this year. I also think worst case scenario, they might be 4-1, maybe worst case scenario 3-2. And then you get into the meat of the schedule here, Iowa at Illinois, Ohio State. The thing with this schedule, I think what I like is that Wisconsin got a very favorable East draw. They have to play Ohio State. Okay, yeah, sure. You can write that off as a loss, but then they drew Indiana and Rutgers from the East, which is, I don't think you can come up with a much better East draw when 2 of your 3 teams are Indiana and Rutgers. What I don't like about Wisconsin, I will say, however, is when I'm looking at this number here at 8.5, my numbers project 8.3 wins. I am going to be lean under. Sorry, guys, but my one biggest concern here with Wisconsin is scheme implementation. How long is it going to take for this to really take form? Will there be some hiccups at the beginning of the schedule? And 2, it's Tanner Mordecai. I know Mordecai was solid at SMU, but when you look at his numbers against Power 5 competition, big drop off there in production. There's a reason why he had to leave Oklahoma and go down to the G5 level. I'm a little bit concerned about that. Big Ten West is known for some good defenses. I'm a little bit concerned with Mordecai, but we shall see. I think this line's up at 8.5 because of the scheduling draw. It was fairly favorable all in all, but I think 8-4 is more likely than 9-3 here. I'm not fully on the Badger train winning the West in year 1 under Fickell, but of course, program trajectory. Are you kidding me? Future's looking very bright.
Yeah, one thing that really surprised me, as you alluded to, was the offensive line. Wisconsin's usually a team that has a pretty solid offensive line, and it was very subpar last year. Of course, they always have a good defense, 21st defensive efficiency last year. Gotta love Wisconsin for that. My big bugaboo with Wisconsin is that they always had good defenses, but very unreliable offenses, and that was always their limiting factor. That's always what prevented them from taking that next step. What I love about Luke Fickell is Luke Fickell and Mike Tressel coming in, really good at identifying talent and developing talent. Phil Longo, proven coordinator for the offensive scheme. They're actually going to start airing the ball out now. You mentioned it. Good room of wide receivers. I'm actually a lot higher in Tanner Mordecai than you are, Shoob. I mean, he had 3,500 yards, 33 touchdowns, 10 picks, 3.3 touchdowns per interception. You're going to win a lot of games when you do that. Yes, he had a struggle at Oklahoma, but that was years ago. He has since developed since then and gotten more and more experience. And plus, you can't tell me that Tanner Mordecai is worse than Graham Mertz. Graham Mertz was pretty bad. And we're also implementing a new system here, which I do give you. I mean, there can be growing pains with that. But overall, I think once they get going, it's going to, once they get going into this new system, I think there's a lot of upside with this team. I really, really like this team. Excellent coaching hires. Love the quarterback coming in. Love the running back depth. They have two bona fide studs at running back. Love the wide receiver room. I mean, they also brought in Joe Huber from Cincinnati, who's a very highly graded tackle as well. So their offensive line also stands to improve, and they bring in a lot of interior offensive line or return a lot of interior offensive line and have good depth there. I think there's going to be an improvement on the O line this year. And then we look at the defense. Cornerbacks, I agree. Secondary here is, I think, is going to be a little bit of a weakness for them. They are projected to actually have two of their true freshmen get some play time this year, and Jonas Duclona and Jace Arnold. But if one thing we have learned from Luke Fickell coach teams, young guys playing early isn't necessarily a bad thing. There might be some growing pains, but 2-3 years down the line, we could see some very elite players. I'm still a little concerned about that. Alexander Smith does return, their best cover corner, but the rest of their secondary does not grade well. I know they brought in Jason Maitre, but he doesn't grade well either. So it's definitely a concern with the secondary, but overall they are well coached. Wisconsin is always a solid defense. I think the secondary will at least be average. Look over to, I don't know, let's just say linebackers. I like the linebacker room. You already mentioned their best linebacker, but I also like CJ Goetz as well. Great against the run, great in pass coverage. Will definitely help with the weaker secondary issues. You already mentioned the losses on the D-line. They returned some production and add a defensive end and Darian Varner for depth on the pass rush. The D-line is probably going to take a little bit of a step back, but ultimately, man, the thing about Wisconsin that's very consistent is defense. Defense. And I know they've lost some pieces, but I still expect them to have a very respectable defense, at least a top 30 defense. And I expect their offense, man, they were 59th in offensive efficiency last year. I think they're going to move into the top 40 this year. I think they can be a top 40 offense this year, and that bodes very well. The thing that has always held back Wisconsin is the lack of having a well-balanced offense. They always seem to have really good running backs. When's the last time you can remember a Wisconsin offense that could just throw the ball on you? I can't remember. It's been a long time. Now, let's look at the schedule. The line is sitting there at 8.5. I say Wisconsin's good for two things, boys. Packing cheese and packing wins, because I'm on the over here. Buffalo, W. At Wazoo, I know they lost 17-14 last year. I think they beat Wazoo this year. I think Wisconsin's just a more balanced team. They have a little more firepower. Georgia Southern's a win. At Purdue could be a little tricky, but I give them the edge because Purdue is a team that is going to be very weak against the run this year based upon everything that's gone on with their defensive line. I think, Wisconsin with their elite running backs are going to feast. Bye week. Rutgers off a bye. I mean, come on. That's a win. You get a probable versus Iowa, but luckily you get Iowa at home. So Iowa is definitely one they could lose. I lean towards a win because it's at home. Illinois, a probable. I like this matchup for Wisconsin. I think they're just a little more balanced, but still a probable lean to win. At Ohio State, I think they can give Ohio State a game, guys. I don't think they're going to beat Ohio State. They are at home in that matchup, but I think they can actually give Ohio State a game, maybe even a scare, or keep it within 10 points. At Indiana's a win. Northwestern's a win. Nebraska, a little toss-up-y because you don't really know what to expect from Nebraska, but I'm not really overly impressed with Nebraska's rosters. I'll say it's a dub there. And then at Minnesota being a probable. So when I look at this, guys, Buffalo, Wazoo, Georgia Southern, Purdue, Rutgers, Illinois, Iowa, let's even say a split there. Indiana, Northwestern, Nebraska, and then I've already got 8-9 wins, and I still got some probables. I still got Minnesota as a probable. I mean, there's a chance that they win. There's a chance that they even win both these games. I like them for 9 wins, guys. I feel pretty good about it. I think Wisconsin's going over, and I think they're actually going to play in the Big Ten championship game this year.
What Wisconsin has going for them with a regime change is, even despite having a whole new coaching staff, I think they have the best offensive line in the Big Ten West. And I think that's going to bode very well because the only defensive fronts that I think legitimately will give them problems this season are Iowa and Illinois. And that brings me right into schedule. How I see this season panning out for Wisconsin is going to be dependent on essentially 3 different pods. And here's what I mean by that. In the non-con beginning of the season, the Washington State and then that first conference game at Purdue, you either got to sweep that or split. Then we jump down after the Rutgers win. You either have to, again, depending how it goes, sweep or win Iowa or Illinois. And at the very end of the season, you got to sweep or split Nebraska and Minnesota. With assessing Wisconsin's personnel, I think it is more likely that the scenario goes as follows. I think they do a clean sweep before the bye week, start 4-0. I think they beat their Big Ten East opponents in Rutgers and Northwestern. In between that is what I think will be the game for the division when they play Iowa, and then having to follow up with Illinois. I think they split one of those, and I think they split Nebraska and Minnesota, and that is enough to put this team at least at 9 wins. I'm over on the Badgers. So I share Xan's sentiments.
All right. Once again, just like the Big Ten East, I am contrarian here. I'm not.
This is a Shoob witch hunt.
Or let's put it this way: I'm not buying exactly what Wisconsin's selling to me in year 1, but we shall see. Wouldn't be surprised if I'm wrong about it. All right, it's time to move on to the Iowa Hawkeyes. Boy, y'all Hawkeye fans, y'all gave us a lot of flack last year when we said Iowa was going to be under their win total. We were correct. Barely, I will admit, because Iowa did have a backdoor shot at winning the West last year, and then they choked against Nebraska, that final game of the year. But yeah, y'all were very vocal about this doubting Iowa last year. Hey, offensive coordinator Brian Ferentz, there's some new incentives now. He's not completely just got a nice cushiony job anymore. Perhaps there is some change in store for Iowa's offense. Maybe the defense. I don't know, Xan. Your facial expression seems to tell a lot. Lead us off on the Hawkeyes here with a line of 8.5.
Let's just jump into the background real quick. Net TARP rating, guys, -8.5. Usually spells regression. -4 on offense, -4.5 on defense. Regression on both sides in terms of loss production. 99th in offensive efficiency, which, guys, I'm honestly shocked. I thought it was way worse than that. I thought it was going to be way worse than that. I thought we were going to be pushing 130s. I mean, their offense was, I thought, one of the worst of all time. I mean, that was ridiculous.
Hey, if you're going to be terrible, at least run the clock. At least run the ball 3 times before you punt.
I mean, seriously, when your defense is outscoring your offense, that's a huge issue. and Iowa is just so lucky that their defense was so elite, which brings me to my next point. Second in defensive efficiency last year. Iowa, elite defense. Always the bread and butter of the Iowa Hawkeyes. The Iowa Hawkeyes kind of remind me of Wisconsin, what I was just talking about. They always have good defenses, but they never really have that prolific offense. That's always the limiting factor for them. Perhaps that can change this year, but they do have a little hurdle with the offensive line, guys. Line yards, 128th last year. Sack rate on passing downs, 100th. Their offensive line is terrible, absolutely terrible. And then not to mention, you bring back Brian Ferentz at OC. I mean, I don't care if you give him incentives. I mean, you can polish a turd, but it's not going to make it a diamond. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think Brian Ferentz was made to call plays. Some people are better off as position coaches. Some people are better off as recruiters. Not everyone is meant to be a coordinator. And I share that sentiment with Brian Ferentz. Phil Parker returns as DC. Amazing defensive coordinator. Always has been, always will be. Really love that for them. Quarterback, man, they obviously take a step up in quarterback. Anything is better than Spencer Petras. Anything is better than Spencer Petras. Shoob, I could throw you in there. You could probably put up similar numbers to Spencer Petras. I mean, it was pretty laughably bad. I mean, I could go in there and go 3 and out every time. Come on, guys. Cade McNamara comes in from Michigan. And he didn't really play a lot in 2022, but in 2021, when he got some go, he had 2,600 yards, 15 touchdowns, 6 picks. So he's got some experience there, definitely much better than Spencer Petras. I think that's definitely a step up for Iowa, and there's some potential there to see the offense improve for sure, just based upon that. I really like their running back, Caleb Johnson, who's a true sophomore, by the way. who had roughly 800 yards rushing last year with 6 touchdowns, 5.2 yards per carry, very solid. Despite having a crappy offensive line, that just tells you he's a quality running back. And he's young. I really, really like that. But then we got to turn over, man, to the receiving room. They lost so much in their receiving room. They lost tight end Sam Laporta, who was responsible for 38% of their passing production last year. They lost Sam 38% of their receiving production in one guy. Good news is they returned Luke Lakey. They love to throw their tight ends, so they have Luke Lakey, and they also brought in Eric All from Michigan. So they still have a good tight end group there. They can still play to their strengths of what Iowa loves to do, throwing to the tight end. In terms of wide receivers, they do retain Caleb Brown, who was a 4-star transfer grade. Although he's not that proven, he's at least a guy that could potentially develop in this system. But they lost Keegan Johnson to K-State and Arlen Bruce to Oklahoma State, both 4-star transfers, both promising players. So they still have some pieces there to do something with, but ultimately at the wide receiver spots, they're a little bit thin. But I do like what they have at tight end, and that is their strength. So we'll see what they do there. O-line, guys, I'm not big on the O-line, honestly. I think the O-line is pretty bad. I don't think it's going to get much better. They're moving, so they're playing some musical chairs, some guys moving from guard to tackle, et cetera, and we'll see if it improves. They brought in Rusty Feth from Miami of Ohio, but I mean, he doesn't grade really well on PFF either. They can only improve, right? I mean, their offensive line was terrible last year, but I still don't think it's going to be a very good unit or a very serviceable unit. Definitely something that concerns me. In terms of defense, guys, let's go to the bread and butter of the Iowa Hawkeyes. Defense, man, secondary, big losses in the secondary. Riley Moss, cornerback Riley Moss, very good player. Safety Kayvon Merriweather, elite player. And then they lost a few other secondary pieces to the transfer portal and lost some depth there. Good news is they do return 2 very solid cornerbacks in Cooper DeJean, who is an NFL guy, and then Sebastian Castro, who's very good against pass coverage. And then they bring back their safety Quinn Schulte, who's very good against the run. So there are some returning pieces there to be excited about, but man, they did lose quite a bit. And I think that spells for a little bit of regression in the secondary, although I still think the secondary will be a pretty good unit, especially with how well coached they are. Lost, man, the linebacker unit, I can't stress this enough, man. They lost Jack Campbell. Huge loss. That man was so good for the Iowa Hawkeyes. They also lost Seth Benson. They lost Justin Jacobs to Oregon in the portal. They do bring in Nick Jackson from Virginia, but he's not what those 4 players or those previous 3 are. And so ultimately they're taking a step back at the linebacker position for sure, an absolute step back. I believe in Iowa's development, but it's hard to replace the caliber of players they lost in just one season like that. There's going to be some growing pains at that spot. Defensive line, guys, they return both starting defensive tackles. They return defensive end Joe Evans and Deontay Craig, all pretty solid against the pass. They do lose Lucas Van Ness to the NFL, but overall, I think their defensive line will still be very solid and stout. I think they've got some depth there. Again, very well coached group. Like it a lot. Now, a big thing for Iowa's schedule, guys. Their line is at 8.5. A huge thing for their schedule. They have probably the luckiest draw of like all teams in the Big Ten. They don't have to play Ohio State or Michigan in the crossover. That's huge. That's huge for their win total. And that's why it's sitting there at 8.5, guys. So let's go into the schedule. At Utah State is a win. At Iowa State, I think they match up really well against Iowa State. I know Iowa State's at home. Iowa State's lost some pieces, man. Iowa State, let's look at this. The Cyhawk last year, Iowa State, most of their offense was generated by guess who? X Hutchinson. Guess who's not at Iowa State anymore? X Hutchinson. And I expect Iowa to be a little bit improved on offense. I don't see this one going the way of the Cyclones. I think Iowa's 2-0. Western Michigan, W, 3-0. At Penn State is a probable. I think they could sneak up on Penn State, but I'm going to chalk it up as an L just because it's an away game and it's probably the whiteout game, as you alluded to, Shoob. Michigan State win. Purdue, I say, is a probable, but they smacked the crap out of Purdue last year, 24-3. And I think Purdue is going to regress a little bit this year, especially with losing their top pass catcher. I think they beat Purdue, and they're at home as well. Then they go at Wisconsin. Probable. I lean towards a loss because it's an away game, but definitely one that they could steal from Wisco. They play Minnesota at home, beat them 13-10 last year. I like Minnesota this year, but I think the overall matchup from a personnel standpoint actually favors Iowa in this matchup, especially with the home field advantage. So I lean towards a win with Minnesota, although it is a true probable for me. Bye week, off the bye week, you get Northwestern and Rutgers, guys. So you get 3 bye weeks, then you play Illinois, who they lost to 9-6 last year. And Illinois, I think, could be another tricky one for them this year. I could see them losing to Illinois again. I know they're at home, but hear me out, guys. The matchup actually kind of works for Illinois here. Very bad offensive line for Iowa. Very good defensive line for Illinois. This is kind of why this is why neither team could score last year. Iowa's defense was elite, and Illinois was just stuffing Iowa every chance they got. So this is one that is definitely a probable for me. Iowa is at home. They do that, which is very significant that they get some of these toss-ups at home. I think it definitely plays into their favor. And then we go at Nebraska, who beat them and ruined their win total last year, 24-17, which was shocking to me. I thought Iowa was a lock for their win total going into that game, but it wasn't meant to be. And so I have that as a probable, but we will see, man. I think they're definitely better than Nebraska. I definitely lean towards a win there, but it's really hard to kind of predict what Matt Rule's going to do with this team or how this team may progress from the beginning to the end of the season in terms of Nebraska. So they may be a totally different team by the end of the season. I see 10 possible wins for Iowa. I'm giving them 7 off the bat. So between Minnesota, Illinois, and at Nebraska, they just need to go 2-1. I think they can do that. Give me the over for the Hawkeyes.
I think what's huge for the Hawkeyes, and you gave phenomenal analysis as always, Xan, is the defense. Defense. When I was an undergrad, I saw a similar situation with the Florida Gators where the offense was lackluster, not historically bad, but lackluster. But the defense was able to carry the Gators to multiple, at least 9-win seasons in the SEC. So I think Phil Parker still leading this unit. I think guys like Noah Shannon, Logan Lee on the defensive line, and just good coaching is going to be able to at least supplement some of those losses at linebacker. And really the secondary returns intact. Cooper DeJean, like you alluded to, is just a huge guy to still have on the roster. And offensively, I was not the biggest fan of Brian Ferentz staying on. I'm not going to say anything about nepotism, nothing of that sort. But I really am hoping that this incentive is enough to light a fire, because if they could utilize Cade McNamara to his potential, put a half competent offense out there, the sky's the limit in terms of Iowa at least maybe winning this division and potentially making a half decent bowl game, depending how that final 12 works out. So let me jump now into the schedule. Before Penn State, they should be 3-0. On the road against Iowa State has me a little cautious, but it's just one of those games where Iowa usually comes out on top of really wacky circumstances. And honestly, Iowa had a chance at the end in last year's game because Iowa State did everything they could to give it away. And given that we're all not too high on Iowa State this year, I'm willing to think that the Hawkeyes win that. So then lose to Penn State, but they might get Penn State fits, but ultimately lose. And then they should be Michigan State and Purdue. I'm just not high on Purdue, and we already gave our take on Michigan State, and there'll be more to come on my thoughts on Purdue. At Wisconsin, again, that's going to be a great game. I'm really looking forward to that one. That, like I said, that is going to decide this division. So you can afford a loss there, and then more likely than not, beat Minnesota at home. Then, like you said, the bye week, the 2 wins, and then if you could just split between Illinois and Nebraska, you're going to hit this total. So as weary as I am about having 2 9-win teams in the same division, it is Iowa's defense and my faith that this offense will take some form of a step, crawl, leap, whatever it takes forward. I am at 9 wins for the Hawkeyes for the 2023 season.
25, boys. 25. That is the magic number. Can Iowa score 25 points per game throughout this year? Brian Ferentz will be retained. No, but in all seriousness, I agree with about everything you guys said. I mean, when we talk about teams being at rock bottom or units being at rock bottom, there's only one way to go from rock bottom, and that's up. Last year, man, we made a living off of Iowa jokes last year. It was honestly very hilarious to watch. In fact, I'm glad that Iowa was that bad last year because I thoroughly enjoyed it. You need some humor. You need someone to be, going against the grain for all the wrong reasons in this sport. It's very funny. But in all seriousness, I mean, I like Cade McNamara a lot, actually. I do. Yeah, your numbers at Iowa are not going to be as good as they were at Michigan, but they're going to be better than Spencer Petrus's numbers. Like, are you kidding me? And plus, the receiver room had a lot of turnover, but I still like their tight end room a lot. I still kind of like a lot of the pieces that they have to work with offensively. So the offense, how much is it going to improve by? That's the golden question. Iowa fans, I know you guys are saying it. You're like, we have an elite defense year in and year out. Just give us a half competent offense and we win the West every year. You're like, just not even a good offense. Just give us an average offense, maybe even a mediocre offense, and we win the West every year. Well, I don't know about average to mediocre, but will they go from horrendous to below average? Yeah, I think they can go from horrendous to below average, poor, however you want to define it. So I think there is a jump in store. The defense, yeah, it's going to regress a little bit, but it's still going to be a top 15, top 20 unit. I mean, other than the linebacker losses, I don't really see that much drop off for the defense. And then another thing, too, is the schedule, the East draw. There's no Ohio State. There's no Michigan. Look at this schedule. Every single game on here, I'm not writing it off as an automatic loss for Iowa. I don't see a single game here where I'm like, yeah, they're going to for sure lose that game. At Penn State, yeah, unlikely. But as I highlighted earlier on the other podcast, if Drew Allar is not in ship-shapedy form in that game, I mean, that there could be some turnovers. There's a chance for Iowa to win that game. There's a window open for that. Other than the Penn State game, which I see is unlikely, I don't see any single one of these games left on the schedule where I'm like, oh yeah, that's unlikely for Iowa. I see the rest of those as wins or toss-ups. Give me an over on Iowa. Can they get 25 points per game? I don't know. Maybe not. But they might be able to score 20 points per game on average and still go like 9-3 or 10-2 with this schedule. They got a very favorable scheduling draw. And whether or not Brian Ferentz is still there, I still think this team is probably my favorite to win the West, believe it or not, which I didn't think I'd come to that conclusion going into this, but I guess we shall see. How about that, boys? Full circle.
I think it definitely comes between Wisco and Iowa for the West. But Gonzo, I just want to mention you brought up the incentive as something that you're hoping will improve things. Let me ask you this. If I offer you $10,000 if you can run a 4.5, are you going to be able to get that $10,000? I can give you the incentive all you want, but sometimes you're just not capable of doing it.
That is a valid point, but I think the difference between me, who physically cannot unfortunately run that early ever, and between Ferentz maybe just lucking his way or Cade McNamara being the tool to do it, I like the chances of that more likely than not happening, especially against maybe some of the more bottom tier teams in the conference. But do
you guys know what would be the most Iowa thing for Kirk Ferentz to be retained? The defense forces a bunch of turnovers. They get the ball at like the 2-yard line. And then all Ferentz has to do is get like 2-yard touchdowns, and he just barely gets over the 25, but the offense is still atrocious.
Yep. That's what I'm saying. That'd
be the most Iowa thing ever. Like, honestly, that'd be the most Iowa thing ever. You keep Ferentz, but your defense basically won you all the games.
I mean, I think that's what's going to happen here. It really, like, that's how they've been doing it for years now. They seem to defy all the turnover luck metrics. I mean, yeah, are they going to force like 25 like they did that one year? No. And we correctly said, yeah, that's not going to happen again. That's insane. But yeah, they're going to be plus 10, plus 15 in turnover differential every year because the defense is so good. And I mean, look at this schedule, guys. What offenses on this schedule scare you? Penn State, maybe with Drew Allar. That's not like that scary. Wisconsin. Potentially, do you think Wisconsin's going to be firing on all cylinders at that point in the season? Maybe. Other than those two, what defense or what offenses, I should say, scare you? Like, I think this defense is going to be really good again. They're going to put up a lot of numbers, which, by the way, if you're looking at these win total lines here, the only reason Wisconsin and Iowa are at the top is because they don't play Ohio State. Or I should say this, their East draws are very favorable. Minnesota, Illinois, Nebraska, they didn't get as favorable East draws. It's whichever teams in the West get the more favorable East draws, the ones that don't have to play a bunch of Michigans or Ohio States or Penn States, those are the ones that are going to have the top lines. It's not about who's the best team in this division. It's who avoids Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. That is the secret sauce in the Big Ten West. So that being said, are you boys ready to move on?
Absolutely.
All right. Gonzo, you shall do the honors here on the Minnesota Golden Gophers with a win total of 7 wins. PJ Fleck's 7th season there. He's been there for a good amount of time now. Gonzo, what do you have on the Gophers?
Total is 7 for Fleck's 7th season. Good old Minnesota. So Kirk Soraka, he leaves for Rutgers. Interesting decision by Kirk. They promote a Greg Harbaugh to coordinate the offense with Matt Simon. I'm interested to see if this Harbaugh's got any sauce in his game on how they can utilize the new starting quarterback in Ethan Kaliakmanis. Tanner Morgan is gone, off to the NFL. And at first glance, I was not sold on Kaliakmanis. And I'm not going to lie and say I was, there at spring games, and I'm covering the kid closely and know what's going on. I don't. I'm not up in Minnesota. But looking at his PFF grade from last year, when he did have to come in to try and right the ship when Morgan dealt with some, injury issues, he graded out fairly well. And so I'm very excited to see how he does. And I think that with him at the helm, Minnesota is in a better spot than some other programs in this conference currently. Taking it down a level to who he'll be handing off the rock to. No Ibrahim, that's a big loss. He was phenomenal for the Gophers. And then Trey Potts says, I'm going to go to Penn State and try to chase a national championship. But you bring in Sean Tyler from Western Michigan, and even though it's the MAC, he's still all conference. You still have to be good to get all conference, even in these lower tier group of fives. They don't just give them to anyone. And he graded out well, even with pass protection, which will be really good for Ethan. And then you've got a backup behind him, Bryce Williams. He only played 146 snaps last year, but that's a 6-year guy. That's some experience in the room. I like this receiving core in general. You bring in Eli Spencer from Charlotte. He was part of the great exodus from Charlotte. He's an all-conference guy. Brevin Spanford is an absolute dude at tight end. Would not be surprised to see him in the NFL after this season. In addition, you get another MACtion guy, Corey Crooms, who's looking to be an impact player from Western Michigan in the slot position. So that's kind of interesting. I know Fleck was at Western Michigan forever ago, but finally somebody from his old school finds him there. And then at the X, you've got Daniel Jackson, who graded out well last year. So all that to say, this is a very fun core that Kaliakmanis is going to have to throw the ball to. The offensive line, it's not great, but it's not terrible. I think it's really good at guard. Axel Rushmeyer, GOAT name. He graded out very well, and he's a redshirt senior. And you got Corday Shaw behind him, who graded very well in limited action, as well as at center. You've got Nathan Bowe, who's a 6-year guy. You've got a lot of just experience on this line. And like I said, not one of the best, but by no means is it pitiful. So now jumping over to the defense, again, you lose Trill Carter to transfer portal. Thomas Rush goes to the NFL, and then another guy, more of a depth piece, transfers out. And this again is maybe an above average defensive line. You got names like Kyler Baugh and Darnold Jeffries, who again, upperclassmen, but didn't grade too well, as well as Logan Richter. One I think that will be a headline of this defensive line is Danny Strigow, a redshirt junior at the end position. Linebacker core, really the only guy of note for me right there is Cody Winenberg. He graded out very well. He's a redshirt junior. Outside of that, you've got, again, some transfers, some freshmen in the mix. And in the secondary, again, I'm in that above average territory. I love Tyler Newman. He's great against the run, great coverage guy. I love Jack Henderson from Hammond, Louisiana, coming in from Southeastern. And he was all conference. He graded well against the run, pass rush coverage, the Holy Trinity. And then as well as Coleman Bryson, who is a returner. He's a sophomore. He's going to slide in at safety. Maybe he'll complement Tyler Nubin in that strong safety spot. And so now with this hodgepodge of characters, let's see what the schedule holds. So they open the season Thursday night against Nebraska. I'd say that's probable. I mean, you got a new look Nebraska team, and it's at home. It's going to be rocking. I think Minnesota does a really good job at getting their fans out there. Again, not that I've been to a Minnesota home game, but that does seem like a Big Ten fan base that gets out there and is very excited. So that's a probable. You beat Eastern Michigan. You know, at UNC at first, I was kind of had it as a toss-up, but with that pass defense, if Kaliakmanis is that dude, this could be one of those games that kind of puts him in there as a top-tier Big Ten quarterback. So for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to give him a win at UNC. They beat Northwestern, and they beat University of Louisiana Lafayette. So at best, 4-1, 5-0 before you most likely lose to Michigan. And then for me, it's just at Iowa, most likely a loss. I think Michigan State is a probable. Illinois is another one of those toss-up games, just depending what day. At Purdue, I think that's more likely going to be a win. Then you lose Ohio State. And Wisconsin at the end of the year, most likely a loss. So I am leaning a push to over for Minnesota. I think 8-4 is possible. I'm not completely sold on it. Shocker, it'll come down to Ethan Kaliakmanis. They will go as he goes. And if he goes how I think, then it's going to be a fun time up there for the Gophers. So over it is for me.
Kaliakmanis, what I like and what I don't like. What I don't like is passing numbers, not as great as Tanner Morgan's. What I do like, rushing ability, far greater than Tanner Morgan. Guys, total yards per play last year. Tanner Morgan, 7.41. Kaliakmanis, 7.49. Whoa, wait a minute. Kaliakmanis, yards per play, just a hair above Tanner Morgan. Guys, I think Kaliakmanis, if he takes a step forward, and a lot of Minnesota people are high on him, they call him, what do they call him, the Greek rifle?
Yes, I think that's what it is.
If he can improve his passing game, this guy's going to be better than Tanner Morgan. He's going to be a more valuable player than Tanner Morgan was. The numbers show it just from last year with a poor passing rating. I am very high on the potential for this quarterback room with Kaliakmanis leading it. And as far as the defense, it was 18th overall in efficiency last year. Yeah, it's probably going to take a minor step back. I still think it'll be solid. I do like the secondary. I still do like a few pieces they're returning there. The schedule, you know, I'm not as high on North Carolina as the market is. I think they have a decent shot to go in there and beat UNC. But I think most likely those first 5 games, I think probably 4-1 going into the Michigan game. That's at least what I would expect. I think worst case 3-2. Best case, they could be 5-0 going to that Michigan game. And then after that bye week, the one thing that I do like about this schedule is they have a lot of those toss-up games at home. They got Illinois at home. They got Wisconsin at home. They got Nebraska at home. I like that. Of course, I don't like they have to play Ohio State and Michigan. That's a tough draw this year. And if you're looking at these lines on the graphic here, why is Wisconsin and Iowa's lines at 8.5 and why is Minnesota's at 7? It's because Minnesota has to play both Michigan and Ohio State. If they didn't, their line would probably be 8.5. So I don't really see them as that much better or worse than Wisconsin or Iowa. They just have a much more difficult schedule having to play both Ohio State and Michigan. I think this is very ambitious here, but I'm going to go over. My numbers have them actually under 7 wins. So I am overriding what my numbers say here because I think Kaliakmanis could be a little bit of a hidden gem here, especially if he can refine his passing game, but we shall see. This is a lean over for me, but this is a tough schedule. I will give it that. It's a very tough schedule, so I'm expecting a lot of good things here from the Gophers.
I mean, I really like Minnesota, guys. I mean, 34th offensive efficiency last year, 18th defensive efficiency, 22 line yards, 31st in pass down sack rate. That's good all around. That is a very, very well-balanced team. But let's look at it, man. With the QB, I'm not as high on the QB as you guys are. I do see that there is some potential. I recognize that there is some potential there for him to improve. And I think he will improve this year. If he can at least be a 2-to-1 ratio guy, then this team is in business. And I think that's definitely something I could see in the cards. Between returning production and what they brought in from the transfer portal, they bring in almost 3,000 yards and almost 20 touchdowns in receiving production. So that's pretty dang good. Not to mention the running back, Sean Tyler, who has back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons at Western Michigan before transferring. So he may not be a Mo Ibrahim, but he is certainly not that bad of a substitute for a Mo Ibrahim. So I think it could be something that works well, especially with a good offensive line. Although I do expect the offensive line to regress a little bit. You can't just lose a center like John Michael Schmitz, who was the best, center in all of PFF, and a few other pieces, and not expect to, have some regression in the O-line. Although I do expect that it will still be a respectable unit, I do expect it not to be as good. I mean, turn to the defense, guys. They lost a couple dudes in their secondary, but they're returning a good safety, and then they're returning their best cover corner in Justin Whaley. Like that a lot. You mentioned the transfers already. In addition to another transfer, Trevin Jones, who's projected to starter from Elon. I think their secondary is going to take a little bit of a step back, but I think it's still going to be pretty solid. It's a very well-coached secondary. I think it's still going to be very respectable defense, and that's kind of the formula for Minnesota. I really like these well-balanced teams. Minnesota is kind of like the Utah of the Big Ten with how well-balanced they are. I would say from linebacker, I'm not really impressed. They have returning production there, but I'm just not really impressed with what they have at that level. That is, I think, a weaker part of their game. They have some returning guys in the interior part of the line, but they didn't grade very well. They lost Thomas Rush, who on their D line had more snaps than any other lineman last season. So that's a lot of experience lost right there. But they do still have two good defensive ends, as you alluded to, Gonzo. And so I'm not going to jump into that. So they are one of the better teams in the Big Ten. I literally have it in my notes, just as you mentioned, Shoob. They're one of the better teams in the Big Ten, but they draw Ohio State and Michigan in the crossover. Very unfortunate. I'm going to say they beat Nebraska opening week. Their defense is solid. Jeff Sims is pretty one-dimensional. I think, and Nebraska, I think their defense is definitely taking a step back. Have a poor offensive line. I think it bodes well, especially being a home game. Minnesota beats Nebraska. At Eastern Michigan, I think they win. I'm with you guys with North Carolina. That's a toss-up. I can definitely see Minnesota winning that game. That one I could teeter to either side of the spectrum. Northwestern, Louisville, with you guys. I'm thinking 4-1 to 5-0 is most likely going into the bye week. At Iowa, now here's the thing, guys. It may be at Iowa, but they get a bye week to prepare for Iowa. I think there is the potential here that they beat Iowa. They get the bye week to prepare for Iowa, and especially if this QB, the Greek rifle here, ends up being the guy, ends up taking some steps this year, that could be a very dangerous game for the Iowa Hawkeyes and the Iowa faithful. Then they go off to Michigan State. Should be a win. We're not very high on Michigan State. Then they play Illinois at home, which I have listed as a probable. Let's not forget they lost 26-14 to Illinois last year. But Illinois lost a ton of pieces, guys. So much on the offensive side of the ball. I'm leaning win for Minnesota in that situation. More balanced. Illinois lost too much. At Purdue, probable. They did lose to Purdue 20-10 last year, but this year's Purdue team is a much different team than it was last year. And the staff has completely turned over. Then you go at Ohio State, it's probably a loss, but they could give Ohio State a scare. They're one of those teams with enough quality on both sides of the ball. They're pretty well balanced, and especially if the Greek rifle here, again, I'm with you guys. It really comes down to him. Their ceiling is entirely set by the quarterback play. And then Wisconsin being a probable. Definitely a winnable game. They're at home. Guys, I think it's more likely that Minnesota walks out with minimally 7 wins. I'm pushed to over. So give me the over on the Gophers.
How about that? 3-way consensus on the over for Minnesota in addition to Iowa. A lot of overs on the board so far here. Start out the Big Ten West. I have a feeling that some unders are incoming. At least that's mathematically what would be possible. But yeah, this team was sneaky, kind of decent last year. I think Minnesota's the best team in the West last year. You can make an argument. They went 9-4 last year. They just didn't have the tiebreakers. Purdue had the right tiebreakers to win the division. That's why Minnesota didn't go to the Big Ten championship game. Yeah, I could see them as a sneaky team here if they can sort of get around those Michigan, Ohio State scheduling draws. But either way, we are all high on the Gophers at 7 wins. Now it's time to head down to Champaign, the Illinois Fighting Illini. To those of you Dynasty viewers who are watching, those Illinois fans out there, I, of course, am going to lead us off because, of course, the Dynasty. So the Illini come in with a win total of 6.5. Illinois went 8-5 last year. What a crazy season. What an exciting season for Illinois fans. Must have been a great feeling to finally be back out of the cellar for the first time in what felt like years. And Illinois has a lot of potential now moving forward with Brett Bielema in his 3rd season there. 8-5 last year. Remember, Illinois started out 7-1. They were ranked really high, but then they sputtered out at the end. They lost 4 of their last 5 games to end the season. Kind of a bitter end to what was a promising season, but overall, man, it was a fantastic season for Illinois. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Offense last year, it was not necessarily the strength of this team. They were 65th in efficiency. Their new quarterback is Luke Altmaier from Ole Miss. Altmaier doesn't really have a whole lot of playing experience. He only threw 17 passes last year. I don't know about you guys, but I look at these numbers here. I look at what we've seen from Altmaier. I don't know if he's an upgrade over Tommy DeVito. I don't think he really is. I think at best, I think he's probably the same as Tommy DeVito. Tommy DeVito was quietly kind of a decent passer last year. So I don't know. Maybe some Illinois fans disagree with me there, but I'm not really seeing it here. At quarterback, at running back, they lose their bell cow Chase Brown to the draft. He accounted for 62% of the team's total carries. That's unheard of. Chase Brown was insane. They, of course, bring in Reggie Love and Josh McCray, who are going to split carries this year, just like in my dynasty. The receiver room, 3 of their top receiving leaders return this year. Isaiah Williams, the quarterback of my dynasty for the first 2.5 years, turned into a receiver in real life. I think it's a pretty good thing they turned him into a receiver in real life because he was pretty dang good. 82 receptions last year, which was 30% of the team's total. Patrick Bryant, Casey Washington, their tight end Tip Riemann return as well. However, one little red flag, they do seem to have a little bit of lack of depth in the receiver room, but I do like the starters. The offensive line kind of below average across the board last year in run and passing blocking rates. However, they do have 66% line continuity this year, which is 4th most in the Big Ten, which means they have a lot of players that had snaps last year returning this year, which is a good sign. I do like their left guard, Isaiah Adams. However, rest of O-line, I think, leaves a little bit of room for improvement. And then the defense. This is what we like to talk about here. The defense, 3rd overall in defensive efficiency last year. However, Ryan Walters, your former defensive coordinator, he is now at your rival. He is now the head coach of Purdue. They promoted Aaron Henry, who was the DB coach, and Terrence Jameson, who was the D-line coach. Those guys are both going to be co-coordinating this defense this year. D-line, I love me some Illini defensive line. They were elite in stuff in the run last year, 6th in average line yards, even though they did have poor sack rates. Jerzon Newton was graded the number 1 interior D lineman last year in the Big Ten. And then they returned Keith Randolph, who was graded number 6 in the Big Ten. So with Randolph and Jerzon Newton, man, they got some heavy punchers there on both edges. The linebacker room, they do play a lot of linebackers because they run that 3-4 defense. I think overall, the linebacker room, average grades, but there is room for improvement there. The secondary is where I think there's just some big losses. The secondary, obviously, you had 3 DBs drafted last year, which is insane development, by the way, but you lose Witherspoon to round 1, Quan Martin to round 2, Sidney Brown to round 3. That's some big losses there in the secondary. Drop-off has to happen, but they do have some returning pieces that leave you some room for optimism that the drop-off is going to be so bad, like Tyler Strain, who was graded well in limited snaps last year, and then Nicario Hopper, who was a 3-star transfer that they brought over from Louisville. So when we look here at this schedule, this non-conference slate, little tricky here. Toledo, yeah, that's a home game. I know they're G5. Toledo was the best team in the MAC. They're projected to be the best team in the MAC this year. At Kansas, that one is also tricky. And then you get Florida Atlantic, who's going to be one of the better teams in the New American Conference. So I still think they should win those games, of course, but those aren't the pushover G5 competition. And then the rest of the schedule here, most of their toss-ups are away. This is the problem for Illinois' line here, is that Kansas is away, Purdue is away, Maryland is away, Minnesota is away, Iowa is away. That's a little bit of a problem here when you're looking at scheduling dynamics. And then their East draw, they do avoid Ohio State and Michigan, thankfully, but you got Penn State at Maryland, Indiana. I mean, I guess more so of a favorable East draw. My number is actually projecting for 7.6 wins, which is a big play to the over. If you're projecting 7.6 and the line's 6.5, that's a hammer to the over, but I'm not as high on those numbers. Of course, the defense can take a step back. I'm not really high on quarterback, but even though the schedule is low-key tricky, I'm still lean over here. And I know this is a little bit, maybe sounds like a little bit of a homer pick here because of my dynasty, but I think that they'll be able to squeak out 7 wins. I think 7 is just more likely than 6, but this one's a little tricky here. I'm not as high as some others are on this team.
Yeah, good points, man. I mean, the strength of this team was defense last year. Offensive line was bad last year. Definitely room for improvement there. In terms of Luke Altmaier, man, I like that he's at least like a dual threat option, and he's a former 4-star. So there is some athleticism there, and he could be a possible commodity that could be developed. But ultimately, in year 1 as a starter, I don't know that he'll be much better than Tommy DeVito. So I expect, to at least hold true to what it was last year, if not slightly regress. Chase Brown, I mean, as you mentioned, I know you already mentioned it, but we can't talk about that. Like, that's their whole offense that they just lost right there. Like the receiver room, you already went into that. We'll see how this group matches up. But ultimately, I think their offense is going to be kind of maybe average at best. I think they'll be slightly below average. And then some losses on the offensive line. Alex Pihlstrom and Alex Palzewski, both really good players, both gone. You already mentioned the returners. I think there's regression on O-line, and the O-line was already pretty bad. Then you go to the secondary. You already mentioned the 3 guys lost to the NFL, but then there's also 3 other secondary guys who played over 600 snaps that were also lost. So their whole secondary is kind of just decimated. They do return cornerback Tavion Nicholson at least, and then they bring in the transfer like you were mentioning, but their secondary, their pass defense is going to just plummet. Ryan Walters isn't there. They lost all this talent. I'm expecting significant regression from their secondary, like night and day, significant. I think they're going to get completely destroyed in the pass. Not to mention they lost their best linebacker, Isaac D'Arcangelo, to the NFL. And so now the linebacker group is kind of suspect. They do return a couple of decent guys, Seth Coleman and Gabe Jackass. Is that his name? It's Jacas, but we'll see. And I mean, hey, that's his name, buddy. But anyway, those 2 are decent, but they're not elite guys by any stretch of the imagination. And then defensive line, man, they lost Calvin Avery. But the big things are you return the dynasty faithful, Xan Newton, Keith Randolph. You still have a really good pass rush and good run stuffing ability on this defensive line. That is the strength, the butter, everything. But honestly, if your secondary is getting burned before your pass rush can even do anything, it's going to be tough. So we'll see how that bodes for Illinois. Surely there is some coaching that can be done here to help mitigate those risks. I see Toledo being a tricky game, as you mentioned, Shoob. Very, very tough. I know you were high on Daquan Finn last year. You were always praising Daquan Finn. And then at Kansas, I have as a probable, but I lean towards an L, citing secondary concerns, and that Kansas is a prolific offense with a lot of receiving options and a really good running back and a mobile quarterback. I think they're going to have a really hard time stopping Kansas. I think Kansas can win that game. And then let's see here. I have Penn State as an L, FAU, W, at Purdue as a probable, Nebraska probable, Maryland L, Wisconsin L, bye week at Minnesota as a probable, lean to an L, Indiana win at Iowa. I think is a good matchup for them because Iowa's O-line is suspect and they have a very good defensive line. So they may be able to stay in that game, and perhaps in late season, Altmaier's developed a little bit. So there could be a potential there for them to give Iowa a game. but ultimately I lean towards Iowa winning that game. And then Northwestern, I think they'll probably win. So I'm counting about 1, 2, 3, 4 wins that I'm going to give them for sure. And then I see 1, 2. I'm not going to give them the Kansas probable. I'm going to chalk that one up as an L. I think they lose that. Between Purdue, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Iowa, I honestly think 2-2 is probably the best case scenario in that group right there. And that puts me at 6-6, which is under. So I'm going under on Illinois.
Great takes from both y'all. I couldn't help but just grin this entire segment just because in following Shoob's dynasty, it is just awesome to see the virtual guys correlate to real life and actually be good on top of that.
Amen.
Newton was the biggest surprise.
Hey, NCAA 14, man, it predicted a lot of players in my dynasty that are good in real life. It predicted a lot of those guys correctly. It's kind of scary.
And if it was really good, the Illini would be playing for a natty in the next couple of years again. Well, they got it right about them playing a UCLA down the road, but that's for another day, of course, with the expansion. But back on task here, my big concern is at quarterback. This isn't Kenton Peoples at quarterback. It's Luke Altmaier, and I remember watching Luke at Ole Miss briefly. I think he might have got some reps in the Sugar Bowl when Corral went down, but he's going to be the big factor here. And I think adding him and losing Ryan Walters to Purdue does have some cause for concern for the Illini. This is a team that still returns a lot of great pieces, as you both alluded to, and it's going to come down, in my opinion, to 2 games. That's what makes or breaks this total for me. Kansas at the beginning of the year, and Minnesota tail end of October, early November. I think those two, a win in either of those games is what decides if the Illini are 7-5 or 6-6. And I think as it shakes out, that they lose to Kansas and going on the road against Kaliakmanis, they most likely lose to Minnesota. I think this is a 6-6 team, but I still think a bowl game for Illinois is fantastic. And I think they still have many things to be excited about, but I just don't see 7 wins for them this year, again, with quarterback questions.
Man, doubting the Illini, guys, shameful. It's absolutely shameful.
Because they don't got David Deal.
They don't have David Deal as the coach. No, but I think that Kansas game is very important because, one, Toledo's not a pushover G5, and then that Kansas game, you have a mismatch with the defensive line versus Kansas offensive line, which is not great, but Andy Kotelnicki, one of the best in college football at scheming around bad line play. So you want to talk about new defensive coordinators replacing Walters for Illinois. We'll see how they match up against Kotelnicki and Kansas's play calling. That's going to be a very good measuring stick because we'll see what they do when they step up to the plate against Kansas. That's going to be a chess match.
Yeah, I mean, their secondary concerns, I mean, that's a strength for Kansas. They have so much returning at wide receiver. They have an NFL running back, great quarterback. I don't see it in the cards for Illinois, but we'll see.
Yeah. Plus, not to mention they have Penn State following that game. So if they go down to Lawrence overlooking Kansas, they're going to be in trouble. So fair warning, but it's time to move on here. Let's head to Lincoln, Nebraska. There's a new head man in town. Matt Rule, he experimented with the NFL. He flirted with the NFL. Didn't go so great, but he is back in his wheelhouse in college football where he belongs. And the Nebraska Cornhuskers now have him. Xan, take us away on the Cornhuskers with a win total of 6 even.
Well, first off, I just want to say that this hire for Matt Rule, I think rules. I think it's a great hire. He's a program builder, works very hard. If you knew his stories from Baylor, there were nights where he would stay up in his office, sleep under his desk because he was just so committed to building the program. And we saw what Baylor was like in his reign. I mean, they were very, very competitive. Now look at the coordinators that Matt Rule has decided to surround himself with. Brought in Marcus Satterfield from South Carolina, and then brought in Tony White from Syracuse, which is a good hire. I mean, Syracuse had a very good defense last year. So I think Matt Rule is getting the right pieces and the right coordinators in position right now, but he does not inherit a very good roster. Let me say that. Offensive efficiency, 66 last year. Defensive efficiency, 92nd. Pretty terrible. Line yards, 82. Sack rate on pass downs, 111th. Terrible offensive line. Matt Rule, as great of a coach and as great of a program builder as I think is in for a very rough challenge or tough challenge in his first year. Now, I think the trajectory for the Nebraska program is really good under Matt Rule. I think they will be very competitive again within the next couple of years. Maybe not next year, but the year after that. You give Matt Rule 2-3 years, I think he's got you back on the map. I really like that. But right now, I don't know. Let's dive into personnel. Out goes Casey Thompson to FAU. That whole experiment kind of failed. We talked about that one last year, Shoob. I was higher on Casey Thompson. You were lower on him. Turns out you were right in that one. And then in comes Jeff Sims from Georgia Tech. Look, I know Georgia Tech is I know Jeff Sims is a little dynamic with his legs, can be quite the threat, but he is not that great of a passer. You could have yourself another Adrian Martinez like kind of situation right here. And we'll see. Perhaps the coordinator hires and Matt Rule can get the best out of Jeff Sims and maximize his potential, maybe improve him as a passer. That is always something to be considered. But overall, I don't expect a significant improvement in the quarterback position in terms of passing, which is huge. I will say that their offensive line is still going to be pretty bad. They did get some transfers, Ben Scott and Jacob Hood, by means of Arizona State, UGA. Jacob Hood, not very experienced. Ben Scott didn't grade well, but their offensive line is still going to be pretty bad. And so I think it's good that they have a mobile quarterback to at least kind of help alleviate some of those pains. But that also concerns me. It makes me think Jeff Sims is just going to be running all the time, and it's going to make them very one-dimensional and predictable. Some other things that I do like, at least, they return Anthony Grant. He's almost a 1,000-yard rusher last year. Could do a little bit better in his yards per carry, but Gabe Irving is actually expected to get some carries as well. So we'll see how that goes for them in a split back carry. Big loss for them in Trey Palmer to the NFL, their best wide receiver, but they actually have a pretty decent group of wide receivers coming in. I'm actually pretty high on some of their receiving options. They bring in Eric Gilbert, tight end. They bring in basically a 5-star, in my opinion, freshman, Malachi Coleman, who's a 96th grade freshman. They bring in Billy Kemp from Virginia, who was hurt last year, but in years prior had 74 receptions, 725 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So he's got some production to add as well. They also return Marcus Washington, who has about 500 yards, and Xavier Betts, who's about a 300-yard guy who looks to improve upon his total. So they've got some options there. So the real question is, you can have options, but can Jeff Sims get the ball to him? That's a big thing. And can the offensive line block long enough for Jeff Sims to not send Jeff Sims into complete run mode? And that's a little iffy for me, especially when we talk about how some of these Big Ten teams have better defensive lines. That could pose matchup issues. Now let's look to the defense. They do return Quentin Newsome. They were at corner. They return Miles Farmer and Marcus Buford, but those guys didn't grade that well, maybe a little average. In comes safety Corey Collier from Florida to add some depth. Overall lost Isaac Gifford, who played significant snaps at safety, and they lost Jaden Gould, who is a 4-star transfer going to Syracuse. So overall, I don't know what to expect from the secondary. I don't really expect it to be elite by any stretch of the imagination. I think it'll be average at best. We will see. There could be room for improvement. We'll see what the coordinator hires do to alleviate these issues and see if they can work around them. Now, linebacker, return Luke Reimer, very good in pass coverage, could stand to improve versus the run and making better reads. I will say they brought in MJ Sherman from Georgia. That's definitely a good get. I think that's a good developmental piece, but we can't ignore the fact that they lost Ernest Hausman to Michigan, who was a 96th grade transfer. Big loss. Rest of the unit, little suspect. I think that level of the linebacking core may not be very strong versus the run, but they could contribute in the passing game a little bit and perhaps give Nebraska a decent or average passing secondary. But I do think I think the run's going to be a weakness for them, guys. I look at their D-line, in addition to what I mentioned about their linebackers. Defensive end, Garrett Nelson, gone. Defensive end, O'Shawn Mathis, gone. Both graded very well against pass rush. They return Colton Feist in the middle, which is good. But other than that, their other returners are not graded pretty well. They do have a lot of young guys who are projected to start for this team. Some of them highly graded, some of them highly recruited. And so potentially we could see a surprise in that group right there. But overall, they're still young players. They're going to make mistakes. I think we're going to have growing pains on the defensive line. Could bode well for the future. But as of right now, I'm not very high on that group. So let's dive into the schedule, guys. They start at Minnesota. I think that's kind of a tough start for Matt Rule's tenure here. I mean, they're playing against a good defense with a pretty solid offensive line, with a quarterback who can run on you, who's got some wide receiver options, and they also have a running back who can run the ball down your throat. Not a very good matchup. I think they lose that game. At Colorado, I think is a probable, just because there's so many unknowns between Colorado and what to expect from this Nebraska team. I think I lean towards a win against Colorado, but we'll see, man. Colorado did bring in a lot of talent, so we'll see who puts it together the best. That game could be a toss-up. NIU is a win. Louisiana Tech should be a win. I'm thinking you can come out 3-1 or 4-0 in those first 4 games. Then you go Michigan, at Illinois, I think is a bad matchup for them. It's at Illinois, bad offensive line versus a great defensive line. You're going to send Jeff Sims running all over the place. Maybe they can take advantage of those losses in Illinois secondary, and Jeff Sims can have himself a game. But man, I think it bodes well for Illinois to win that. Although I have it as a probable, I lean towards an Illinois win. I will go bye week. They beat Northwestern, get revenge for last year. Then they go play Purdue as a probable, not as high on Purdue. They could definitely beat Purdue. At Michigan State is a probable. It's at Michigan State. And as we're not very high on Michigan State, guys, but as you mentioned, I think there is some truth to this. Michigan State plays up and down to their opponents. I think this could be a very close game for Nebraska. I could see it going either way. Maryland, I think they lose. I don't think it's a good matchup for them personnel-wise. At Wisconsin, I think they lose. Iowa, they're at home. They surprised Iowa last year. I don't think they do it again. Guys, I am seeing about 3 wins that I just straight up give them right off the bat. I've got 5 probables. So their line is sitting there at 6. So I've got 8 winnable games for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Between the 5 probables, I need 3 for a push. I need 3 and 2 for a push and 4 and 1 for an over. I think it's more likely that they're going to go under. So I hate to do it, Nebraska. I'm going under on Nebraska Cornhuskers. Although I will add, I think your future is very bright under Matt Rule.
Excellent analysis, Xan. I share the same thoughts in terms of the long-term outlook for Nebraska. I think in a few years, they will finally be getting back to a place that this fan base has been longing decades for. So the future is very bright in that regard. I think some people forget. I forget what Matt Rule's first year was at Baylor. I want to say they were like 1-11 though. Like it was a rough first year, but then not too long after, he's winning the conference. He's going to Sugar Bowls. He's competing for playoff spots. So definitely a great long-term outlook. I said earlier in this video that I thought Wisconsin had the best offensive line in the division. And I echo that point to say that I think Nebraska might have maybe the worst in this division. I just think in terms of losing guys like Brock Bando, Trent Hickson, who aren't world beaters, but losing veterans, seniors like that, and just looking at who's coming back, they didn't grade well. The depth's not necessarily there. I think that's a big red flag for the Cornhuskers, especially with the defensive lines that they'll be facing in this division. Like you alluded to, I do like the secondary. I really think, especially at corner with Quentin Newsome and with Omar Brown in the nickel, those are some good pieces there. But, a good secondary can only take you so far when your defensive line and backers are kind of just average. So looking at the schedule, I see I like the three guaranteed wins with Northern Illinois, Louisiana Tech, who could cover that game. Louisiana Tech is not as atrocious as some people might think. They actually might be a half decent Houston team, honestly. And sometimes those teams sneak up on Nebraska at home. We've seen it in the past. And then Northwestern. So that's 3 there. Colorado, most probable, I'd say. So 4. So kind of like I alluded to with other teams, I think this is going to come down to Minnesota and Purdue. I think that if they win both those games, this goes over, but I just don't think that's likely. I think they're more likely to lose that opener and then maybe beat Purdue later in the season, depending where the Boilermakers are at. In all honesty, this is absolute push territory, but because I'm going to give a position, I am pushed to under. And I still think 6-6, that is phenomenal in year one. I mean, I remember Scott Frost's first year. I'm pretty sure they didn't make a bowl game. I think it was like 3-9. So if you can make a 6-6 team with Sims leading the charge, that's a great start for Matt Rule. And again, I'm not too confident in it, but I am on the under.
The Scott Frost era was a train wreck, man. I'm sure they're glad to be in the Rule era now.
When I look at this team, man, lines of scrimmage, no bueno. Very, very no bueno for Nebraska. If I'm not mistaken, they're starting 2 true freshmen on the defensive line, right? They have two projected true freshmen starting on the defensive line. That's not a good sign. I do like the coordinator hires. I've heard mixed reviews about Satterfield. Tony White for sure is a great hire on the defensive side. I'm going to go to Jeff Sims here, and I'm going to go to bat for Jeff Sims a little bit. I feel like, yeah, his numbers at Georgia Tech on paper do not look good at all. But keep in mind here, he started at a Georgia Tech team that was transitioning from the triple option. He had a very bad coach that got fired, and then he had an interim last year. I feel like Jeff Sims hasn't had a really good coaching staff around him, and I feel like this is a good spot for him to potentially unlock another level to his game. I mean, let's keep in mind, he was a former 4-star recruit, so that talent upside is there. But with that being said, I mean, yeah, you guys covered the roster. It's not a very good roster. Lines of scrimmage especially is a huge problem. I'm pretty confident on this under here. But as you guys have said, look at Matt Rule's coaching history. If you're a Nebraska fan and you're pretty unsure about this coaching hire, which to my surprise, a lot of Nebraska fans weren't happy with this hire, which I don't understand at all. But if you're still skeptical, go Google Matt Rule's coaching history and look at what he inherited at Temple. Look what he did with Temple, and then look what he did with Baylor coming off the Art Briles scandal. Maybe they'll be competing for Big Ten championships in a few years. Well, I don't know. It's going to be tough, but we all agree trajectory is looking good, but this is a rebuild in year one, under across the board at 6 wins.
Nebraska, man, you know one thing, their fans, they deserve it. They sell out every game, no matter how bad they are. They've got some money, man. With Matt Rule, I'm sure NIL will come in. I really do think they will eventually be a big dog in the Big Ten with their financial backing, their fans, Matt Rule's ability to build a program. It may not be for like 3-4 years before they're like top tier, but man, if they go bowling in year one, guys, that's huge.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is going to pan out. I really do. But let's move on here. Purdue. Boy, you want to talk about more coaching staff turnover. The Boilermakers have a new head man in town. They made the Big Ten championship game last year too, which was pretty kind of crazy how Purdue ended up being the one that's like the pinball machine. It's like they ended up balling up in that one slot. It was Purdue. They won the lottery. They went to the championship game. They have a new head coach, Ryan Walters, coming over from their rival in the battle for the Purdue Cannon. Gonzo lead us off on the Boilermakers, sitting with a line of just 5 wins.
Well, it's definitely going to be interesting times for the Boilermakers. They kind of knew what to expect with Jeff Brom. I mean, he made them a more semi-relevant program in the Big Ten with some high-profile wins over Ohio State, again, making the Big Ten championship. Just a level of success they probably hadn't seen since Drew Brees attended in the early 2000s. Of the coaching hires, my favorite, of course, is Graham Harrell. I alluded to him on the Big 12 podcast. I think that's a phenomenal addition to replace Brian Brom. And the toys he gets to play with, he gets Hudson Card from Texas. And Hudson did what he could coming in relief for Quinn Ewers, almost beat Alabama. I'm like fairly certain he played that game hurt. So he's definitely a serviceable quarterback. I personally have some questions on how he'll translate playing now in the Big Ten and just coming into this situation. But compared to what they had last year of Austin Burton, Alamo, Brady Allen, I think he's an upgrade really over all three of those guys. The wide receiver core, average last year. You return guys like TJ Sheffield, Mershawn Rice. You lose Charlie Jones to the draft. That's huge. I mean, he was a baller. As well as at tight end, you lose Payne Durham. And it's just a unit that does not really excite me too much outside of they bring in a transfer from FAU, Jamal Edrin. He graded all right on PFF, so maybe he can supply something at that second outside spot at the Z position. This offensive line, again, above average type unit. Gus Hardwig returns to anchor down center, and that's always huge when you can anchor down that center position. That is the captain of the O-line right there. Marcus Embo at right guard. You do lose Spencer Holstage, and you bring in a couple transfers to compete with guys like Jared Benzinski for the spot. So at the interior, you're set. My questions more so are at the tackle positions, though. Just will those guys be up to the same speed that the guards and centers are? Moving now to the defensive line, you lose Jack Sullivan, he transfers out. Orange Johnson transfers out, but you got Kadrin Jenkins coming back as kind of those hybrid linebacker pass rusher types. He graded out very well. He's a senior. And then you've also got guys like Cole Brevard and Mo Amond in the interior. You bring in a bunch of, funny enough, SEC transfers to come in and shore up the interior defensive line. And I think Corday Sindor is another one who you should look out for on the DN line. He graded very well in coverage or more. Linebacking core, really nothing stands out to me. They lost 3 guys. OC Brothers comes back, but he didn't grade too well on PFF. And just that room does not really impress me. I got questions at cornerback. You lose Reese Taylor and Corey Trice, as well as your nickel guys and Jalen Graham and Bryce Hampton. And then they've brought in a bunch of transfers in this room, which is to be expected with a new coaching regime. But I will say I do like these free safeties, Cam Allen, who's a 5th-year senior, as well as Sunwisi Kane, who's a senior. So I think these guys are going to be a bright spot on that unit. So Purdue just screams from a personnel-wise average, which is good. That is a good thing for Ryan Walters to be coming into. He doesn't have to completely turn it over like some of these other coaches about teams we've discussed. So sitting with a 5-win total and looking at their schedule, last year's Fresno State team, I would have given a shot. I think the Jake Haener loss is massive for them. So that's most likely going to be a win. On the road against Virginia Tech's going to be a win. Syracuse, I kind of have as a toss-up. I don't think Syracuse was a fluke last year. Not saying I don't, and we've talked about this on the ACC win totals, but I just think Syracuse is no gimme. Wisconsin is most likely a loss. Illinois, that's going to be a fun reunion. Wish it was in Champaign, but that's a toss-up. I think they lose to Iowa. Ohio State is the definite loss. Then the bye week. At Nebraska, I have as a toss-up. Michigan's a loss. Probably lose to Minnesota. And then you can at least finish the year feeling really good about yourself, being Northwestern, Indiana. I got a lot of probables on there. This was a really hard one for me to try and come to a decision on. But ultimately, I just think in year one, with Hudson Card having to be the guy and just a few questions defensively, I'm under. I'm not confident in it, but I just think 5 wins is a more appropriate number for Purdue in this first year, but I could easily see myself being wrong. Just a lot of unknowns with this team in its first year.
Well, here's what I like. Graham Harrell, offensive coordinator, good hire. I think West Virginia's offense last year punched above their weight class compared to, with the players that they had on that offense. Hudson Card. I like Hudson Card a lot. I've been pretty vocal about that. Yards per play last year. Hudson Card, 7.79. Aiden O'Connell, 6.29. Perhaps a bit of an upgrade at quarterback, believe it or not, with Hudson Card. What I don't like, pretty much everything else. I mean, just look at the roster around Hudson Card. There's just too many holes with this roster. I mean, Ryan Walters, first year head coach. I mean, it's going to be a little tough. It's going to be a little tough. And then the scheduling draw. They drew Ohio State, Michigan from the East. I mean, what a terrible draw. I mean, for a first year head coach to get Ohio State and Michigan as your East draw. This team last year, yeah, they made the Big Ten championship game, but they were 5-2 in one possession games last year. This team really wasn't the best team in the West. They just kind of got really fortunate in one possession games, and they got really lucky with the tiebreakers. I'm seeing 6 wins as the ceiling. That's if Hudson Card stays healthy all year. I think 5 is actually kind of a low end for this win total, but I think 5 is the most likely outcome. A Hudson Card injury would just kill this team. I'll tell you that much. If Hudson Card gets hurt, oh, yikes, this is going to go off the rails. No pun intended. But yeah, I think 5 wins, if you get a full healthy season of Hudson Card, is probably in the cards. Pun intended there.
2 for 2.
2 for 2, man. I'm firing them off right now. But yeah, I lean under here. It's a tough hand to be dealt for first year head coach Ryan Walters.
Yeah, for sure. Same high on the offensive coordinator hire for you guys. Love it. I think he'll be able to maximize Hudson Card and really because one thing about Purdue last year, guys, is their whole offense was Charlie Jones. They were entirely reliant on Charlie Jones. He had 110 receptions, like 1,361 yards and 12 touchdowns. I mean, he was their whole offense, basically. And they lose Charlie Jones. I'm surprised you guys didn't highlight their running back. As a true freshman, Devin Mockabee had 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns, 5 yards per carry. I actually like him a lot. He's got a lot of potential. He'll be a true sophomore this year. And I expect the offensive line to, it wasn't a great unit last year, but I expect it to return a little bit. They're returning a lot of people. I expect it to improve a little bit. And so depth is a concern, but their overall starting group, I think, should be enough to improve even so slightly. They do bring in Jamal Edrine from FAU, who brings about 600 yards and 6 touchdowns worth of production in to kind of supplement some of what they lost. But I think Graham Harrell is going to be really good at utilizing a Mockabee and utilizing multiple targets and not being completely reliant on one like Charlie Jones. He's good at that. And so I think there's some upside with this offense for sure. And I do like Ryan Walters. He is a defensive mind. He's a guy that I think can definitely maximize what they have at the position. Not a big fan of them losing their top cover corner, but they do bring in a ton of secondary guys through the transfer portal, by way of the transfer portal. And although many of them are not really all that proven, if they're coached up correctly in a system, I think there is potential there for it to be a decent group, or at least be a group with some depth. They do return their both starting safeties. You mentioned that, Gonzo. I like that. Linebacking group is a little more to be desired there. I don't really like it that much. They do lose 2 defensive linemen, both 4-star transfer ratings by way of Miami and USC. So interior line is definitely going to be a weakness, along with the linebackers. They're definitely going to be weak against the run. So teams with really good offensive lines or really good running backs are definitely going to have their way with these guys, unless they find a way to coach around it. I gotta say, I've got concern with even the rest of their defensive line, guys. I know they brought in Jeffrey Mba from Auburn and Malik Langham from Vandy, but aside from that, I mean, there's a lot of depth concern and unproven commodities on that defensive line. Look at the line here. They do play Fresno, I have as a probable, but I lean to a win because it's at home. Fresno doesn't have Jake Hayner. I think there's something to be said about that. They still have overall more talent or more star talent on the roster than Fresno. So we'll see. And I think they have a good coaching staff. At Virginia Tech, I have as a probable. I'm not chalking that up as a definite win. I'm a little higher on VTech than you guys are. I think that could be a good game. I do lean to favor Purdue in that game, but it would not shock me if they lost that game. Syracuse I have as a probable. Wisconsin I have as an L. Illinois is a probable. At Iowa, an L. Ohio State, an L. Bye week to prepare for Nebraska, I think, is huge. I know it's at Nebraska, but a bye week certainly helps. And if they have any injury issues, they can get right to play that Nebraska game. We already mentioned that Nebraska is kind of one of those wildcard games. That's a probable. At Michigan's an L. Minnesota is a probable. I think they can match up with them, but I think they're going to lose that game. They did beat Minnesota last year, 20-10, and that's why I think that they can potentially do it again, especially being at home. I know it's a new coaching system, but then you get Northwestern Indiana to finish off the year with 2 wins right there. So let's just look. Fresno State, Northwestern Indiana, I'd say they can at least get 3, maybe even Va Tech, that'd be 4. And then I have 8 total winnable games, including the ones probables and like guarantees. So if you give me 3 for sure, and then basically go 2 and 3 in those 5 winnables, I think that's doable. So I think they're at least going to push at 5. And I think 5, let me just say this. I don't think 4 is likely. I think 5 is much more likely than 4. But I do see some potential upside with this coaching staff to where there could be 6 wins in the cards. So I'm actually going to lean over on Purdue. I think 6 is more likely than 4, but I think 5 is perfect.
All right, there we go. We got an over for Purdue from Xan. Gonzo and I are on the under at 5. Yeah, this one was pretty tough. This was one of the tougher ones, admittedly, that I had in this division. I think, honestly, this is probably the one that I felt the least confident about, other than maybe Wisconsin. So, with all that being said, I think it's time to wrap it up here with the Northwestern Wildcats. And boy,
the best team in the Big Ten.
They have been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. If you are watching this or listening, I think what's today, July 16th. So it's been a few days after Pat Fitzgerald has been let go of his duties after the hazing scandal. Well, here's the problem. Northwestern, you lost Pat Fitzgerald, man. That guy was, I mean, he's a Northwestern legend. He's done so many good things for that football program, more things than you can count. It's going to be a bit of a problem. He is let go after 17 seasons at Northwestern, man. That's honestly, it's just a sad, it's a lose-lose situation all around there. That just sucks. But yeah, this team's record last year, Northwestern was undefeated on foreign soil. They were 1-0.
Ireland, baby.
Their domestic record, however, was 0-11. They did not win a single game on U.S. soil last year. This year, I think Northwestern will get their first win on U.S. soil in 2 years when they host UTEP in week 2. But no, with all that being said, back to the coaching situation. Interim head coach is David Braun. He was the defensive coordinator. At least he was named the defensive coordinator going into the season. He was just hired as their new DC from North Dakota State, actually. Very interesting hire there. But he is now going to be the interim head coach. So we'll see how that plays out. The offense last year, again, no bueno, 97th overall in efficiency. However, one thing that I do kind of like, if there's one positive I can say about this team, is I actually kind of like their quarterback room a little bit, because they brought in Ben Bryant over from Cincinnati, which hindsight's 2020. I don't know what Ben Bryant was thinking when he decided to come over to Northwestern, because I think Ben Bryant could have started at a lot better of programs, put it that way. I'm sure he had his reasons, but this was actually a pretty good addition for Northwestern. I like Ben Bryant a lot. They actually have a little bit of depth and experience for Northwestern standards on the quarterback room, because they retained Brendan Sullivan and Ryan Helinski. Both those guys played a lot last year. So, yeah, quarterback production was not great, but they at least have 3 guys that have played before. So it's one positive you can say about this roster. The rest of the roster, however, running back, they lost their Evan Hull, who was their bell cow man. And I mean, he was their bell cow running the ball. He also was their second leading receiver last year.
1,500 all-purpose.
That's insane. I mean, a guy like that, that's just a massive loss individually. And then the rest of the receiver room, of course, their top 3 leading receivers from last year are all gone. They got 2 new transfer wide receivers from Michigan and Arizona State. Offensive line last year, they were terrible run blocking, but they had decent pass blocking rates. The big losses, of course, left tackle Pete Skoronski, who was the number 1 graded tackle in the whole Big Ten. He, of course, went in the first round. They have 3 true freshmen projected as backups on the offensive line. So
Yikes.
Injuries is a big concern. Absolutely. Defense last year, defense was actually pretty decent. They were 55th overall in efficiency. However, they only returned 5 starters. Defensive line, a little poor last year, 114th in line yards generated. I'm not going to go a whole lot into the defense last year, but overall, when I look at this team, like I said, I like the quarterback room a little bit, actually, but not much else. Defense probably likely takes a step back from last year. They were 55th. I think that's punching above Northwestern's typical weight class there. And then the schedule. As I mentioned, other than probably UTEP and then definitely Howard, other than those 2 as I chalk up as wins, those are the only 2 games where I see as for sure wins. We already talked about how much I'm higher on Rutgers this year. I don't see that as a win. Duke, definitely not winning that. Rest of the schedule, I mean, maybe when you get Purdue at home late in the year, that could be a potential win. But Ryan Walters' first-year head coach, I don't think that team's just going to, be on quit alert at the end of the year by any means. This is rough, guys. This is not a good situation. I feel really bad for Pat Fitzgerald. Feel bad for those players. Line's sitting at 3.5. This is at least what the line was before it got pulled by all the sports books. So whenever it feels like we're kind of cheating here, because I think if they bring this line back, I would absolutely hammer the under. This would be an easy under because my wins only project them for 2.1. And that was before Pat Fitzgerald got fired. So yeah, anything that's above, let's say 2.5 or above, I'm hammering the under here with Northwestern. This is a tough situation all around, and I am on the under at 3.5. Very, very safe under in my opinion.
Yeah, I share that same sentiment, man. I mean, Pat Fitzgerald was the king of, winning like 1 game and then turning around and winning 10 games and going to the conference championship. He was elite at doing that, pulling a rabbit out of the metaphorical hat. But I do like that they brought in David Braun from North Dakota State. I think that's at least a bright spot. I think he's the, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he's the interim in charge now. So he's got some national championship experience at the FCS level. I do like Ben Bryant, as you mentioned, but God, man, they're running backs that are going to replace Evan Hull. Just get this: Cam Porter, 3.3 yards per carry. Anthony Tyus, 2.9 yards per carry. Terrible. Wide receivers, there's basically no production returning. Their leading receiver in terms of production has 200 yards. Terrible. Ben Bryant really set himself up for failure by going here. They lose their best lineman. It's bad, man. It's bad. They lose their best cover guy in the secondary in Cam Mitchell. They return 2 decent secondary pieces, but the rest is like, there's not a lot of depth. It's a little suspect. Linebackers should be decent. It's at least probably a bright spot for this team. I think they have a decent set of linebackers for sure. They lose pass rusher Adetomiwa Ababiwari. I mean, I'm sure I butchered that, but he was graded pretty high in pass rush. But at least they bring in transfer defensive end Richie Haggerty, who actually grades pretty similarly, if not higher. So that could be a trade for a trade. But ultimately, guys, there's not a lot to be excited about from this Northwestern team. Ben Bryant is legitimately the only bright spot on this roster, and maybe some of the secondary returners. But other than that, man, it's tough. At Rutgers, I have as a probable. I mean, I'm not going to completely discount Northwestern against the bottom of the Big Ten. Maybe they can pull something out of their hat. But I don't know. That's kind of tough. It's an away game. UTEP I even have as a probable. I know you have them as a lock. I do lean W against UTEP. It's at home. At Duke, L. Minnesota, L. Penn State, L. Howard should be a win. Bye week to go at Nebraska. They had Nebraska's number last year. They come off a bye week to play Nebraska. I'm giving them a probable on that one, although I lean Nebraska for the win there. Maryland L, Iowa L, Wisconsin L, Purdue probable. They at least get Purdue at home, which could be big for them to maybe steal a win. It's late season though. I feel like by that point in the season, Purdue might be fighting to try to get bowl eligibility, and Northwestern's not fighting for anything by that point in the season. I think Purdue's going to win that. At Illinois, same situation for Illinois. I think they'll be fighting for that 6th win to get to be bowl eligible. I don't think that bodes well for them either. I'm with you, Shoob. I've only got 1 for sure win, 5 possible winnables if I'm like being optimistic to like them just not completely falling apart without Pat Fitzgerald. But even with that, man, I can't see them winning more than 2-3 games max this season. So I'm definitely on the under.
I want to give y'all this number just for some even more context. All time, when I would do football picks, when I pick Northwestern on the money line, I am 31-11. They were an absolute favorite of mine throughout the years. And I love Pat Fitzgerald. My uncle was a big Northwestern guy. He didn't go there, but he just really liked Northwestern and Pat Fitzgerald. And I'm not going to speculate. It's just a sad situation all around, all of it from what the news has said. You guys have nailed the personnel, and I'm not going to hide the ball. I'm on the under as well. UTEP and Howard are really the only 2 wins I see on this schedule. And I hope that Northwestern with Big Ten money can get somebody there to get them to even half of the places and success that Pat Fitzgerald took them to.
Yeah. I do want to mention, you guys know there is a new budding rivalry in the Big Ten. Penn State, Northwestern.
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't know if it's too early for jokes here, but I was like, what Micah Parsons was like, man, I really wish I went to Northwestern after hearing all that.
He's like, damn, I would have flourished there.
Micah Parsons would have had a hell of a time at Northwestern.
Oh yeah, he would have loved it.
But anyhow, yeah, I think that's the outlook for this program is kind of bleak now. If I had to say my personal opinion, this is going to be a decision that we're going to be looking at like 3 or 4 years from now. We're going to be like, yeah, that was a mistake. But that's just my 2 cents. All right, gentlemen, anything else to say before you wrap it up here?
I'm just curious who Northwestern's going to keep or hires their head coach. If they're going to promote Braun at the end of the year, or if they're going to go and make a big splash with the Big Ten money and try to get someone good. We'll see. Hey,
big opportunity for Braun though. If somehow they actually do muster up a few wins here, that this could be a huge opportunity for him. So he could win the lottery here. But I guess we'll see. Well, with that being said, we have under as the consensus on Northwestern at 3.5 wins. Well, gentlemen, the Big Ten West is complete. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you're on podcast, leave us a review. If you're on YouTube, leave a like for the video. Hope you enjoyed this very, very detailed and informative analysis of all these teams. If you're a fan of one of these teams, please leave a comment. Let us know what you agree with. Let us know what you disagree with us. Let us know what your predictions are for your team this season. Let us know. We love to interact with you guys in the comments. And with that being said, this is the Saturday Scholars, Xan, Gonzo, and Shoob, signing out. The SEC, the finale is up next. See y'all later. Have a great day.
Turnovers are not a repeatable skill.